Hello, everyone, and welcome back to SALT Talks. My name is John Darcy. I'm the Managing Director of SALT, which is a global thought leadership forum at the intersection of finance, technology, and geopolitics. SALT Talks are a series of digital interviews we've been doing in lieu of our in-person conference that do deep dives into topics that we think are relevant to the investment management community and our global community. So today we're very excited to dive into a topic that's especially relevant given what's going on with the global pandemic. With Alex Dinner, who is the that focuses on read a little bit more about Alex's bio. He is a Ph.D. as well as the founder and CIO of Sarissa, as I mentioned. He's been investing in healthcare companies for the past 2 decades. In 2013, he founded Sarissa to capitalize on the compelling opportunities for positive shareholder activism created by the unique dynamics of the healthcare sector. Dr. Dinner has led Sarissa's involvement in some of biopharma's most successful strategic transactions and activist campaigns. Prior to founding Sarissa, he was the healthcare portfolio manager for Icon Capital. And at Icon, he developed Icon's activist strategy in the healthcare sector and was responsible for some of the firm's most successful investments. Prior to joining Icon, he was a healthcare portfolio manager at Morgan Stanley, as well as at Viking Global. Today, Alex serves on the board of Biogen as a director, and he's the chairman of the medicines company. He received his bachelor's degree from MIT and his master's and PhD degrees from Yale University. If you have any questions for Dr. Dinner on today's chat, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your video screen. And I'm going to turn it over to host the interview to Anthony Scaramucci, who is the founder and managing partner of Skybridge Capital, as well as the chairman of SALT. So Anthony, you go ahead and take it away.
I appreciate it, John. Alex, it's great to be with you. You got a fascinating story. John's bio of you is great, but I want to hear more. Tell us more about your background. Tell us how you got to where you are, because I want people to understand the significance of your credentials before I start asking these questions.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for having me speak with you. So, my background, basically, I have my academic background is in essentially biomedical engineering. And, from there I went to Morgan Stanley. I had always been interested in investing and, basically became also interested in activism. The idea that for many companies, they're not well managed. There are a lot of principal agent issues, and the companies are often run more for the management teams than the companies themselves. And there's a very interesting intersection there between healthcare and activism. And I, so having a background in biomedical engineering, I had a thesis on identifying people as susceptible to certain types of ventricular arrhythmias, certain types of heart attacks. Basically we approached the situation with the philosophy that in healthcare, companies are because they have very high margins and very high barriers to entry, the opportunity for the opportunity for a company to sort of be undermanaged and still kind of get away with it, if you will, is higher. I actually approached Carl Icahn with this kind of philosophy, and sort of started doing investing in that, and I've been involved in a whole bunch of transactions and investments in the healthcare industry over time. And really what we do is we get in and we try to fix companies. So we've been involved in, as John has said, Biogen, the medicines company, Ariad, Imclone, Genzyme, MedImmune. There's a whole bunch of companies that we've been involved with and really tried to make better, and often through that process end up in an M&A situation.
So you know a lot about science, and you know a lot about research into vaccines, and you know a lot about this disease that the entire world is now struggling with. And so I want to go right there and tell us a little bit about your opinion of the various organizations that are working on a vaccine and working on therapies to help people that have COVID-19.
Yeah, sure. So, I think there are approximately 160 people out there working on vaccines, and countless, more than 1,000 sort of efforts that are on therapies. I think that it's at this point, vaccines are a very hard business, right? And I think we should sort of take a step back in terms of thinking about it from a societal point of view. It's very hard to develop vaccines, and there are viruses for which we haven't, HIV being a classic example. There's been, people have been working on for decades, and we don't have vaccines that work. And there are also viruses, dengue fever being, probably the sort of most highest profile example, where vaccines have been developed that can actually make an infection, a subsequent infection from the disease worse. So a person can be vaccinated in certain circumstances get worse because they had been vaccinated when they get an infection of dengue. So the development is very complicated, and we have to sort of look at look at things in that light. I am optimistic that we're going to have a vaccine relatively soon. In fact, I think we'll have a number of them. There's a bunch of different technologies that people are working on. The ones that are sort of the highest profile, and certainly in the U.S., are probably the mRNA vaccines, where Moderna is kind of the leader there. Pfizer is also, has a bunch of candidates. That particular technology has never been successfully implemented in an approved vaccine. On the other hand, the data that has come out so far has been very promising. And one of the most exciting parts about that approach is that it's relatively quick. You can design the molecule that could produce the immune response and test it quickly and also scale it quickly. So if one of these RNA or DNA vaccines works, it's pretty easy to make, relatively easy to make hundreds of millions or billions of doses. The sort of more traditional technologies of using vaccines where the virus has been, like the actual virus, it's a killed version of the virus, or a more sophisticated technology called live attenuated vaccine, where we basically take the virus and don't kill it, but damage it in a way that it can't cause a serious infection. Those types of vaccines generally have very good immune responses, like our bodies react well to them and create robust responses. But the timelines to develop them are much longer. It's sort of.
So Alex,
hard.
what time frame are we talking about, though? When you say relatively early, when do you think we'll see the vaccine?
So there's a lot of people working on them, and I think that given the data that's come out, heretofore, I think it is possible that we'll have multiple vaccines that are showing efficacy, this year. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think there'll be a widely available vaccine this year. And I think that it will take some time to sort of scale it up. Moderna has been highlighting that they think that at the beginning of the year, they may be able to scale to a large number of doses to treat, a significant percentage of the U.S. population, but they might be able to treat sort of high-risk people earlier than that. There are many risks to that, though, and I think that it's not, I'm more hopeful than I was 2 or 3 months ago in terms of a vaccine being developed in the next few months, but I think it's important to note that we may not have a vaccine at all for the next couple of years. That is possible. And we have to think about kind of how society will adapt if that is the case.
But you're optimistic. Yeah, and just one more question on this, because I think our audience is actually interested in this stuff. What can we learn from the prior pandemics? The Spanish flu pandemic, as an example, no vaccine, yet the society did go on to progress, and we created the Roaring '20s shortly after that pandemic ended. So what can we learn from that? Exactly.
No, that's a very interesting area. Look, there have been many pandemics in history, as you know, and it's, in the Bible, they mention the plagues and, the smallpox and cholera and the Black Death in Europe. And, These things have occurred many, many times. And there are many, kind of historical lessons that we can learn. They generally, without mitigation, kind of most viral pandemics last a few months and they have a few waves. So think of a few months long wave, and there's usually maybe 3 waves. And, in this case, we have, this is the first time the whole world has really coordinated to do social distancing to slow down the vaccine. So it'll change the dynamic somewhat. But I think we can sort of look to history and say, well, this has happened many times before. We've got through that. Almost all respiratory viruses have a seasonal component. So I think that's an important part here, that although we're seeing, like in Texas and Florida, an increase in the number of cases, and that's very troubling. I think that's something that we should all be focused on. I do expect, I think the sort of the best guess is that there'll be a reacceleration of viral infections in the fall. That just sort of most respiratory viruses behave that way. And that occurred with the Spanish influenza, that occurred with, kind of lots of influenza pandemics. From a societal point of view, like in the US, we're learning a lot about how to manage the disease medically. Like, we just saw the recent news on dexamethasone being used, and basically, kind of in the later stage of the disease, it helps, which is very important to know.
But let's explain how it helps. So what's happening is you're getting an overreaction from your immune system, right? And it's flooding your cells in a way that's causing a breakdown. And so it's an immunosuppressant drug to knock that down. Is that a fair characterization?
That's exactly correct. So the virus this virus has an acute phase that typically kind of lasts, say, a week or two, and most people clear the virus. Some people don't, the ones who get more severe disease, and they tend to have an overreaction of their immune system. And steroids can be used to dampen that down. Also, tocilizumab is also used in that regard. It's important that we understand that steroids can actually, reduce our body's ability to fight an infection. So you generally don't want to give them early in the stage of an infection. But when someone's in that state where their body is overreacting to the infection, the steroids can be very useful. And that's an example of one of the things that we're learning, kind of as the world gets experience with this in terms of medical management, managing people who have severe disease. And I think, even in the absence of a vaccine and in the absence of any new therapies, and I do think we'll have things beyond remdesivir, in the absence of those, the doctors will better understand how to manage patients and improve outcomes. And one of the things that's interesting is that the disease appears to be a disease of endothelial dysfunction. So it's a disease related to clotting of the blood. It's not just a lung infection. It's doing other things systemically. And I think that that the recognition of that is becoming sort of, people, that's generally believed to be most people would say that's generally probably what the virus is, and that medical management of that, like reducing oxidative stress, that type of thing, can help improve outcomes.
So I'm going to ask you 3 questions in rapid fire succession. And so you can give me a yes or no, your opinion, of course. COVID-19, is it worse than the flu?
Yes.
The mortality rate is worse than the flu?
Yes.
At this stage in the pandemic, would you take your kids out to a restaurant?
I think probably a qualified yes to that, but I think you have to do that very carefully. I actually went to a restaurant today. It's the first time I've done that. It was a restaurant by the sea. you know, we were 10 feet away from everyone
Alex,
else.
did you have a martini or something? Hopefully you have. What did you drink at the restaurant? Don't tell me iced tea. I'm going to cut the, I'm going to cut the internet.
Unfortunately, that is what we had as iced tea.
Yeah, iced tea. All right.
You know, I think that, you know, during the daytime, when there's, you know, kind of a breeze, if you will, when there's sort of a, you know, people are not close together, I think it's very important that who you're having, choosing to have a meal with. If you go to a restaurant, it's a very important thing, right?
So you were out. Let me just stipulate for everybody: you were outdoors. You were eating al fresco.
I was outdoors, and you know, 10 to 15 feet away from anyone else. And look, I think that you know, that was a calculated risk doing that. That's I don't think we should be doing that a lot. I do think that in the, like, I live in Connecticut, in this area, the virus was very bad a few months ago. It was horrible. It was really, really bad. And it's come down a lot. And so I think it depends a lot on where you are geographically too. But during the summer, I think it's important to kind of get out a little bit and not to.
What about flying an airplane, Alex? Would you fly in an airplane?
No.
Okay,
no,
tell us why not.
I think that the, look, obviously there's always a risk-benefit analysis with that, and sometimes if you need to fly for some important reason, I would do it, I guess. But you know, an airplane, the whole process of commercial airline flight is very, you know, has lots of opportunities for introducing infections. So the actual being on the plane, you're in an enclosed can. Sitting next to people who you don't have any idea of sort of their viral status for an extended period of time. You're touching lots of things. You're interfacing with lots of people. You got to go through an airport to get to the plane. You got to go through security. You got to go to the gate. And when you get out of the plane, you got to go through an airport. You have to think about transportation to wherever you're going. You know, those types of things are, you know, for me, I don't plan on going on a sort of, you know, commercial flight for a vacation kind of purpose in the near term.
There are people that think if you've gotten the disease and you have the antibodies, you can still get the disease. So can you still get the disease after you've gotten the disease? And what's the difference between synthetic and natural antibodies? So
once a person has has had the disease, it's very unlikely that they can get it again. I mean, almost impossible. I don't want to say impossible because there can be, it would be very, very hard for a period of time. I think what the question that we don't really know is how long does immunity last for this, this particular infection. When somebody gets a chicken pox, they get essentially lifelong immunity to that virus. In the case of coronaviruses, the immunity that most people get lasts, you know, kind of months or a short number of years. So I think that, you know, again, we don't know, but based on sort of an educated guess on similar viruses, it's probably the case that a person can get reinfected in a year and a half, but not 2 months later. With respect to antibodies, so, you know, our bodies, when a person gets infected, there's a bunch of, our immune system kind of kicks in, and there's a whole bunch of things that happen. And, you know, one of the things that happen is that there's a part of the body that makes antibodies, which are substances that go and find things that look like the virus and latch onto it and essentially kill it. And those, that's what, once we've had the infection and our body has created the antibodies, the virus usually goes away, or almost all of it goes away very quickly. You can take, so somebody that's had the virus and then recovered will have antibodies in their blood. So you can do so-called convalescent plasma, where you take the blood out of a person who has recovered from the infection, isolate the antibodies, the plasma in the blood, and then inject that into a person who's suffering from an acute infection. That usually helps people. There are, you know, it's not 100% clear that's efficacious, but it's very, very likely that be efficacious. Then the next step is, let's make those those antibodies synthetically. So what I just described is taking an antibody from somebody that had an infection. It's obviously kind of hard to scale, and there's a lot of complication with that. It'd be great if you can design the antibody and manufacture at scale and give it to people, so they would have, it's kind of like a mini vaccine in a way. That is a very exciting approach. I think the technical probability of that working is quite high. There's a bunch of companies working on that. I'm involved with on the board of a company that has a role in that. Probably the leader is Regeneron. They've been working really hard and have some very exciting ideas, and they're pursuing that very quickly. That's not something that can be, making the antibodies is a complex process. So it's not something that can be scaled to sort of giving them to everybody in the world. But when we have data that the synthetically created antibodies work, they probably would work prophylactically and therapeutically. So in other words, they would probably work to prevent an infection if you gave it to a person who is at high risk for an infection, as well as if you gave it to a person in the early stage of infection, it probably would make the disease go away more quickly.
So in listening to you speak about this, and obviously we know a lot about you and your firm, you're cautiously, can I frame it this way? You're cautiously optimistic about a therapy and a vaccine, and let's call it over the next year. Those
Yes.
things will unfold.
Yes, I believe even more than over, hopefully sooner than that even.
Okay, so in your mind, you've been an investor for your whole career. So what does that mean for the U.S. economy? What does that mean for the stock market? And what does that mean for the industries and the sectors that you're involved?
Okay, so in terms of the societal and the investing impacts, I mean, I think first of all we have to think of all the different possibilities, right? So it is possible that we have no vaccine for 5 years, right? It's important for as an investor to sort of have that in the frame of possible outcomes.
If that happens, Alex, I'm going to stick half of my Skybridge employees in that beautiful office of yours. Okay, we're going to be living rent free in your house. Okay.
There you go. You're absolutely welcome.
Keep going.
So that said, I do think it's very likely we'll kind of have some therapies. Economic recovery is all about confidence, right? So I think it's less about the sort of the technical level of virus protection in the population, and whether it's 69 or 73%, but it's people feeling confident that if they go out, they have a low chance of getting a serious disease from doing that. And that can come from a vaccine, that can come from sort of better treatment so that the disease much more rarely becomes serious. I do think that will occur, kind of sort of relatively soon, certainly not this year, but kind of probably the beginning of next year. And I think that will allow, kind of us to get back to sort of a something quasi normal. There are industries like, that are very restaurants and things that'll probably take longer to kind of get back to full normal. And there are industries that, where work from home is working well, that probably will be that are unaffected now, or, relatively effective there.
So, you don't have to give specific stocks, but just give us generically the sectors that you're the most bullish on. And if you want to give specific stocks, or even are allowed to, I don't know what the regulations are around your firm, but where are you? What are you long? What do you like? What don't you like?
So we invest in healthcare stocks. I think one of the most, so one of the things that's gone on here is that in healthcare, appropriately, everyone is focused on the coronavirus. So that, the companies that are working on that are sort of at the highlight of everybody's thinking. And in fact, when you look at sort of the healthcare index performance, it's been largely driven by a few names that have benefited. The stocks have gone up a lot because they offer promise to sort of have a vaccine or a treatment for the coronavirus. As a healthcare investor, I think that there are promising investments there, and we're pursuing them. But I think the bigger opportunity is actually in the sort of non-coronavirus related healthcare therapeutic side. Those companies are being not ignored, but they're getting less attention than they normally would. Cancer is still, unfortunately, just as serious a disease as it was 6 months ago. Heart disease is still, unfortunately, just as serious. And there have been changes in the industry, like the FDA has had to adapt very rapidly to the coronavirus, and regulations that were well-intentioned, but were really kind of slowing the industry down, have been bulldozed away. Kind of one of the best examples of that is in the telehealth area, where before 6 months ago, very few people used talk to their physicians over the internet. It was done, but it was a very small part of the healthcare ecosystem, and the government didn't pay for it by and large, and it was very difficult. That has changed completely now, as everyone knows, and I think that frankly is good for everyone. That society will be better off, having that trend having accelerated. There are many regulations in healthcare that have been disintermediated by this coronavirus, and basically, whether it's CMS or HHS or the FDA have issued emergency guidance. There's a technical matter is limited to the time during the coronavirus emergency, but I think we've permanently changed how we do drug development and
permanently changed, but in your mind, better, right? I mean, a little bit less. We both know the thalidomide story from the 50s, which really stunted the FDA. And for those people that are so young that they don't know that story, they blocked that drug. It was a morning sickness drug. They blocked it in the U.S. They allowed it in Europe. The side effects of it was it caused limb deformities. And so the FDA celebrated that they slowed it down, and that made it a lot harder to get drugs through as a result of things like thalidomide. So you're saying they've opened this up a little bit, but we also know that they have more scientific data now than they did in the 1950s, and they're able to do broader testing. So that whole process makes those drugs safer. Would that be safe to say?
Yes, I think that, look, the thalidomide is a great example to bring up. I mean, the FDA has a very important role to play in evaluating drugs, and they're going to demand, and rightfully they're going to continue to demand, safety data, especially in the tragedy of thalidomide, where a morning sickness drug actually caused birth defects, right? That kind of thing will still be done and should be done. But allowing some of using technology in clinical trials, not all things have to be done in person. That just many of the sort of bureaucratic rules that have existed because there was no other way to do them when they were implemented have been swept away. And I think, frankly, it's going to accelerate drug development. It's going to accelerate the value that the healthcare system delivers. We all know the healthcare system. I think the drug development system in the U.S. is fantastic and works really well. The healthcare delivery system doesn't. I don't think anyone thinks that that's kind of extremely well functioning. And I think we're going to come out of this with a better healthcare system. I think that many of the sort of lots of the over-regulation and the sort of balkanization of the healthcare system, people have been forced to work together because of the coronavirus, and it works better. And we're gonna end when we get past this. The healthcare delivery, I think, will be better for it. I mean, the whole experience of going to a hospital will be easier for patients, will be better for the healthcare providers. Doctors will be better able to treat patients. I think it's really going to be it's that there's a silver lining in all of this.
Well, and I think that's an important segue, Alex, because, in the crisis, a lot of opportunity gets born. In the 2008 crisis, we actually started the SALT conference as a response to that crisis. And so I'm very optimistic, as you are, that things will change for the better. I want to turn it over to our viewers and listeners. John Darcy is going to ask you some questions that are coming in over the transom here. And we've got a ton of audience participation. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, the first question relates to your process as an activist in the healthcare space. When you're identifying potential targets for an activist campaign, how do you dive into that business and differentiate in terms of measuring why their performance suffered? How do you differentiate between a company that was mismanaged, that actually has good drugs, but was just fundamentally mismanaged, and between companies that either have drugs that are flawed and aren't performing well because of the quality of the drug?
Okay, so that's a good question. We do a lot of work, on that. Basically, it's gumshoe research, right? I think that, we have a very we have a great team. MDs, PhDs, people that are really expert in healthcare, and we dig deep into into the pipelines and the currently marketed products of each of the investments that we make. What we look for, our process is basically we look at companies and we sort of look at we say, okay, we know the products, the pipeline, the technologies that they have, and then we because we have a lot of experience in the space, we know the space very well, we can sort of put a cost structure around that. So we can sort of say, okay, if the company has 3 drugs in certain therapeutic areas, we know how much it will take to sell those drugs. And to first order, we don't take account of what the companies, whether they have, what their cost structure looks like. We just sort of build what it should be in our model, and we DCF that. And we look at that DCF compared to the market price. When there's a huge difference, like 2x, we sort of get interested. And then we say, if there's a way that we can put leverage on the company, can we push the company to change their strategy such that it's better run for investors, the owners, then we'll get involved. And we typically will take a position and typically seek to join the board. And kind of often that involves a management change, although not always. And in doing that analysis, we really look for products, because it's a long-term strategy that we get involved in the company. And we're investing. We plan to be investors for years. That we look for things that are innovative, that truly add to, that benefit patients, that ameliorate a disease in a real way. And those are the types of companies we get involved with. We're less interested in a company that has a Me Too thing that's just sort of maybe slightly better than somebody else, because we need to have a very big difference between the value when the company is run properly compared, and the current market price. The other thing to note is that people in the sector, we interface with a lot of investors, and we get a lot of feedback. So a lot of institutional shareholders will call us, and we may hear from our 5 or 6 institutional shareholders over the course of whatever, a year or whatever, that they're unhappy with the way a particular company is being run. And that's usually not something that's news to us, but it helps us understand the psychology of the shareholder base, that they're ready to sort of implement change, that they're ready to sort of kind of push the company to be run better.
Thanks for that, Alex. The next question is about the telehealth space. What's your general view on telehealth, and do you have any favorite names in the space?
So I like telehealth a lot, as I mentioned earlier. I think that it's going to become a bigger part of healthcare. I don't have any particular favorite names. I think that one should think about telehealth as the specific part that the visible part where the patient interacts with the physician, but also there's a lot of kind of things that can be done with even clinical trial work where you can do remote monitoring of patients. The types of things like we were talking earlier, the FDA is traditionally, the FDA has been very forward thinking in many things, but it's taken some time to get to incorporate some of these technologies. And I think by necessity, if a company is developing a drug where they can't, it's not easy to sort of have a patient come in every month to the doctor. The solution may be sort of a telesolution. So I think it's going to be it's a very important part of healthcare now. It's going to become more important over time, and it's going to make the system more efficient.
Thank you for that, Alex. The next question is, you talked a little bit about a timeline for a vaccine. What would you put in terms of your degree of confidence in percentage terms of a vaccine coming out before the end of 2020?
So first of all, let's define what this means. I think to have data that shows that one or more vaccines have some level of efficacy. Let's say they reduce severity of the disease in a large fraction of patients, or maybe they provide sterilizing immunity in 50% or 70% of patients. I would say that the probability of that occurring by the end of the year is more than 50%. I would have said less than, I would have been a much lower number 3 months ago or 2 months ago. But I think we've seen some data that's been published that has been very exciting, from a number of different groups. Now, there's a different question though, which is, when is a vaccine going to be broadly available, say to Americans or globally around the world? And I think that's something that's unlikely to occur. A broad availability of a vaccine is unlikely to occur this calendar year. And sort of if everything goes right, in the U.S. we may have access to that. It's sort of say in the first quarter of next year. But that sort of requires everything kind of going right. So I would say that there's maybe to have a vaccine widely available, a 50% chance of it widely available probably would be by the first quarter of next year at 50%. And I would say 75% by the end of next year.
Thank you. In terms of geographically, do you focus on U.S.-based companies, or what do you view as the opportunity within healthcare in emerging markets like India and China?
So we look at all companies around the world. We do everything in healthcare. That said, we sort of focus on therapeutics. In a lot of the innovation in therapeutics is happening in the U.S. So we tend to be sort of U.S. focused. There's a lot of opportunity in the U.S. for what we do. Healthcare companies, it's really hard to develop drugs, but when they do it, it's a very high barrier to entry, very high margin business generally, and it's easy for companies to sort of get lackadaisical with respect to capital allocation. So there's an opportunity for us to get involved. So if it's a U.S. company, just most of the companies end up being U.S., but we look globally. In China, in India, look, I think one of the things that's coming from the coronavirus is India, for instance, has a fantastically sophisticated generic drug business. There's a bunch of companies that brought a lot of innovation and brought pills, generic pills available at very low cost to a lot of the world. But what I think a lot of people come to realize is having domestic capabilities, especially as a matter of national security for the U.S., is very important. So I think that you're going to see an increase in the amount of sort of, kind of basic provider, generic manufacturing, if you will, in the U.S., so-called API manufacturing, active pharmaceutical. I don't think that'll come to the detriment of India and China, but it probably will reduce their growth rates. compared to what was projected before the pandemic.
Thank you. We have one final question, another one about your investment process as an activist in the healthcare space. So a lot of times activism within healthcare is focused on going into mature companies and trying to identify ways to improve their financial performance. How do you look at activism in the therapeutic space for companies with pre-approval drugs or that are earlier on in the drug development process?
So, first of all, our type of activism is kind of a little bit different than sort of the classical activism, in that we look to fix the businesses, and that's a very hands-on thing. Where we get involved with the companies in terms of the way the operations are being run, and sort of make capital allocation more efficient. We hopefully kind of allocate R&D better, that type of thing. And that can be done in the late stage and early stage the same way. That said, we tend to be focused on later stage companies because we like companies where there's multiple drivers of cash flow. But there are many early stage companies that have frankly, because the index, the market's been up a lot recently. There've been a lot of companies perceive their cost of capital to be essentially zero, and they've been, kind of spending, less judiciously than they should be. So that I think there's an opportunity for activism there, but that is not the sort of the kind of classic activism of the financial type thing, which we tend not to do anyway.
All right. Well, we want to thank Alex Dinner for joining us today on Salt Talks. Anthony, I don't know if you have any additional final thoughts.
No, I mean, I think he wins Room Raider so far. I mean, I'm impressed with all the paneling behind you there, Alex. God bless you. Wish you health and safety, and hopefully we'll get some real medical progress on this. But I think it was really terrific today, Alex, that you put it in historical context, what we're all going through, and how we're all going to come out of it and hopefully be just fine. But in the meantime, I wish everybody great personal safety, health, and happiness. And Alex, we'll hopefully see you soon. And I promise you, I'll be buying you martinis. You won't be drinking iced tea with me, Alex. Okay, that's my promise.
That sounds great, Anthony. Thank you very much, and thank you, John, and health and happiness to both you guys, and stay safe, and appreciate that you're there.